Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets, joined by my good friend, producer, and co-host out of Portugal, Paulo Alves. And just as with our special episode a few days ago on Frank Vogel, one of the frontrunners of the current Houston Rockets coaching search, today we've got a special themed episode on the other man who I currently believe is a frontrunner in this ongoing search, that being Ime Udoka, most recently head coach of the Boston Celtics last season, before a scandal took his job prior to training camp leading into this current season. So just as we had Caitlin Cooper a few days ago, a special guest breaking down Frank Vogel from years of watching him in Indiana, we've got a special guest today, Dr. Justin Quinn, managing editor of Celtics Wire. That's the USA Today sports media group equivalent for the Celtics of what I do with Rockets Wire here in Houston. You can go to CelticsWire.com or RocketsWire.com to read all of the daily coverage about those teams. And if you look for the Ime Udoka tag, you can see Justin's coverage in recent months of everything that went down between Udoka and the Celtics. And so just as we spoke with Caitlin the other day about the good and bad of Frank Vogel, we're going to be doing the same today with Justin, talking about the good, the bad, and, well, I suppose the ugly that resulted from the year plus that Udoka was in Boston. It's a definite contrast compared to Frank Vogel, who was in Indiana for 10 years, 4 as an assistant, 6 as a head coach. Udoka was only in Boston for, again, barely over a year, but there was a lot to unpack, both positively and negatively. Obviously, the results on the floor were excellent. The Celtics were 36-36 the year before under Brad Stevens. Udoka took them to a contending level. They won the Eastern Conference, got to the NBA Finals. He seemed to unlock something in Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. They're 2 all-stars. He got them to another level defensively, was very creative in some of his schemes. Caitlin talked about how he used Robert Williams as a roaming big. At this time a year ago, he was talked about as one of the best young coaches in the entire NBA, and he was leading one of the most prestigious organizations in the game. He seemed to have everything. And at just 45 years old, he could be the coach for a generation. Again, the Celtics were and are set up very well organizationally, not just in terms of their leadership, but also the players. There's so much young talent on that roster. It's not like Tatum or Brown are going to go anywhere, at least as far as the Celtics can control. Now, who knows? Maybe Jaylen Brown looks elsewhere. Cough, Houston. We can certainly hope. But the point is, organizationally, they're set up really well with not just a core, but a young core that can contend for a long time in the Eastern Conference. Udoka led them to new heights a year ago. His players spoke extremely well of him. Everything seemed to be leading up to him being the coach for this generation of Boston Celtics basketball. And then the scandal with a female subordinate that undid it all. The Celtics hired a law firm to independently investigate what had happened. They found uncomfortable power dynamics, again, with the alleged affair involving a female subordinate, and the Celtics felt that he could not continue in his role as head coach, and so he was replaced on the eve of training camp, and he has remained on the coaching market ever since. There were reports that he came close to getting the Brooklyn job in November, but the Nets ultimately chose to go with Jacques Vaughn instead. So we're going to be talking about everything with Justin Quinn, not just the on-court product with Udoka and what he showed over his season in Boston leading the way, but also the baggage that accompanies him and what some of the key takeaways are there as well when it comes to the Rockets and their current search to replace Steven Silas. So I'm going to structure this episode the same way that we did the Vogel themed pod the other day, which is that I'm going to update you guys with the intel that I have on the front end. And then that way, once we get Justin connected, we can make this all about him and all about the Boston side of the equation and what he picked up following Ime Udoka very closely for, again, about a year and a half, a full season, the offseason preceding it, and then the offseason after as well, because it wasn't until the eve of training camp that things really unraveled between Udoka and the Celtics. So I'm going to give some initial comments here about the state of the Rockets search as of Thursday night, April 20th, and then the rest of the episode will be myself and Paolo interviewing Justin and picking his brain about Ime Udoka. So, as of April 20th, this is the latest I've heard. Overall, it's been a much more productive search for the Rockets in 2023 than it was 3 years ago in 2020. And that might sound a bit surprising at first glance because in 2020, the last time the Rockets head coaching position was open, they had the longest active streak of consecutive playoff berths in the entire NBA. They had two former MVPs, James Harden and Russell Westbrook, on the roster. But there were so many red flags at that time coming off the loss to the Lakers in the bubble. It was a veteran-laden roster. There was no salary cap room. There was very little in the way of young players, not many draft picks. They had mortgaged everything to try and fill out that roster around James Harden, and yet it had not brought them a championship. And James Harden was of the age, and there were already a few reports starting to leak out that he could look at another team that might give him a better shot to win than the Rockets could. There just weren't very many levers left for the Rockets, be it Daryl Morey or his eventual replacement, Rafael Stone, to pull. So there were all sorts of red flags surrounding the Rockets. You could see, I guess, an iceberg in the way of where they were moving. And so even though the product on the floor at that time was a very competent basketball team, the outlook for the next few years was very dicey. And that's why the few credible coaches that were on the market in 2020, Doc Rivers went to the 76ers, Ty Lue went to the Clippers, the Rockets were having a tough time getting in the door. As opposed to 2023, look, I know the Rockets were 22-60, but there's a lot of young talent on this team. Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, Jabari Smith Jr., Kevin Porter Jr., Tari Eason. There's a lot of young building blocks. They have the most salary cap room, give or take about $60 million of any team in the NBA this summer. There's a new report out today that the Rockets remain very much in the game for James Harden should he decide to leave the Sixers. A Rockets reunion definitely still a possibility. Of course, many other things the Rockets could conceivably do with that cap space as well. They're going to get one more high draft pick in 2023. And then they have the future draft assets coming from Brooklyn starting next year. And well, they did have one in 2022 with Eason, but it's starting next year. The picks coming in from Brooklyn that are really enticing because now that the Nets no longer have any superstars, first Harden, now Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, they've all forced their way out of town. Now it really looks like those future draft assets from the Nets might actually be pretty damn good. And there's direct pick conveyances in 2024 and 2026, pick swap rights in 2025 and 2027. Hopefully those are valuable as well, because that's around the same time we think and hope the Rockets will be making their rise back up the Western Conference standings, back into at least playoff mode, and hopefully more than that by the time we get to the latter part of this decade. Stay tuned. Anyway, as far as the coaching search, what this means, while a lot of people on the outside are looking perhaps just at the standings this year, I think for people whose livelihood depends on projecting the future, there's optimism about the Rockets. It's not just about what the roster currently is, it's about what it's going to be. And the Rockets have players that are likely to get a lot better. And also that cap space represents opportunity. It allows the Rockets to potentially remake the roster, certainly with veterans, but also veterans that may play the preferred style of a given coach. There's just a lot of options, a lot of flexibility, a lot of ways that you could mold this young team to the preferred style of a coach. And assuming the money is there from owner Tillman Fertitta, which I believe it will be, and assuming that the relationships are there with the front office, guys like Rafael Stone as GM, Eli Whitus is basically the number two, then this can be a pretty attractive gig. And so I've heard the Rockets, they've interviewed quite a few names by now, and they've been impressed with the quality of candidates. They've got two big name former head coaches in Udoka and Vogel that I believe are the front runners. They've also interviewed James Borrego, formerly head coach of the Hornets. Not going to say quite to the pedigree of Udoka or Vogel because obviously the Hornets aren't a contender. Former head coach nonetheless. I'm told he interviewed very well. Adrian Griffin, a former NBA player, currently assistant with the Raptors, he interviewed. I'm told that went well. Also, I don't think those two are quite to the top tier of Udoka and Vogel, but certainly guys the Rockets are interested in, and perhaps they end up having something to say about the assistant search Once the Rockets hire a head coach, they'll give that coach the autonomy to hire his staff, and perhaps someone like Borrego or Griffin can figure into that. It definitely sounds like they made a positive impression with the Rockets front office, and while the Rockets front office won't be picking the assistant staff, that's in opposition to the Daryl Morey years. I do believe Rafael Stone is putting a priority on having a more conventional structure, and I think that will help them lure a really qualified head coach as well, giving them full autonomy. It certainly can't hurt if some of these options do already have relationships with the organization and perhaps feel good about what's going on here in Houston. So to this point, I think nearly everyone has interviewed well, and there's lots of qualified candidates. There's more on the way. Sam Cassell is interviewing on Sunday. Cassell is an assistant with the 76ers. That complicates his availability because, of course, the Sixers are playing, as I'm recording this, against the Brooklyn Nets in Game 3 of their first-round playoff series. Rockets have also secured permission to interview Kenny Atkinson, lead assistant associate, I believe, with the Golden State Warriors, to Steve Kerr. That interview has not been scheduled because the Warriors, of course, are trying to somehow get back into their series against the Sacramento Kings, even with Draymond Green suspended for Game 3. So time will tell as to the scheduling on that. But the Rockets are getting in the door for big names, and then from what I'm hearing, the conversations are going very well. The biggest takeaway, again, Bogle interviewed last week, Udoka this Wednesday, and I do think it's noteworthy that as we're recording this Thursday night, it's pretty clear that Ime Udoka is still very much in play for the Rockets vacancy. There's nothing happened during their conversations with him to turn the Rockets front office in a different direction. And that's noteworthy because I'm quite confident in saying the Rockets did ask about the baggage, everything that happened that led to his dismissal in Boston, or his suspension, I suppose, and eventually led to him being on the market and available to meet with the Rockets despite all the success he had this time a year ago. The Rockets did do vetting before the interview. They did check with references. I reported that earlier in the week. But of course, the Rockets need to ask Ime themselves as well. That's part of any due diligence process. It can't just be about talking to other people in HR. You also have to talk to the person involved about it and get their perspective, and also hopefully hear how they've learned from it and hopefully how it's not going to happen again. And the fact that the Rockets are still saying positive things about Ime Udoka being a formidable candidate, I do think that is another positive sign that he is going to be evaluated on his own merits. I think the timing is very different relative to what went down in Brooklyn. I know the Nets pivoted a different direction, but that was just 2 weeks into a new season. It felt like there were no consequences. With this job, we're talking the next season. There have been some consequences. So I do think in terms of the PR backlash, it's not quite the same. People are more willing to give a second chance if it feels like the person was properly held accountable for the mistake in the first place. And so I think relative to when the Nets looked into Udoka a few months ago, the timing is different for the Rockets now, assuming the vetting checks out, assuming he answers the questions about the incident in the right way. And from everything that I can tell, he's done that because, again, as I'm recording this Thursday night, all the indications that I have are that he is still very much in play. So I don't think that there was some bombshell in the interview, or else we'd be told by now, well over 24 hours later, that they're looking a different direction. No, I think he had a great interview, just as Frank Vogel did about a week ago. They're both defensive minded coaches, but I think they have very different resumes, very different personalities. And so the Rockets are going to have to see which one fits best with their front office. And perhaps they'll talk a little bit in terms of the parameters of what the coaching staffs look like, who each is going to bring in. Again, it's about the whole picture, alignment, and it sounds like both these guys are most likely going to come back for further conversations. I think they are at the front of the list right now. As far as our pod the other day, I mentioned two other names in the top tier, Kenny Atkinson and Nick Nurse. What I will say about those two, while I don't think either is out of play as far as the job with the Rockets, each day that passes without a credible report linking them to discussions with the Rockets makes me less optimistic about their candidacy. And I'll start with Nick Nurse. The main thing, and I expressed this the other day, he's still under contract with the Toronto Raptors. According to reports, he's owed about $8 million to coach next season. That is not an insignificant amount of money. And as long as he is under contract with Toronto, he's not going to be able to interview with the Rockets or any other NBA team. He would have to come to a split, which would likely require him giving up some or all of that money in order to become a coaching free agent. Would he do that if he's not guaranteed of the job with the Rockets? I don't think he would. And yet I don't see how the Rockets can guarantee him the job because it's not like his resume is that much better than Vogel or Udoka. Sure, Nick Nurse is a defensive minded coach, and I think that's generally a tilt that the Rockets have. The rule of opposites, as Jonathan Fagan of the Chronicle has pointed out, often applies in these searches. And Stephen Silas was offensive minded, so perhaps they lean a bit more defense this time, more discipline, more accountability, more structure, wanting players, the young prospects especially, to compete harder on a more regular basis. Sure, you can point out that Nick Nurse is a defensive minded coach who won the NBA title in 2019 with the Raptors. Guess what? Frank Vogel is a successful defensive minded coach who won the NBA title even more recently. Ime Udoka is a defensive-minded coach who was in the NBA Finals last year. So I don't think that Nurse's resume is so superior that you can just give him the job. And without that, is he going to give up the money that's on the table from Toronto that he's already under contract for to essentially throw his hat into the ring? Because right now, the Rockets are one of only two vacancies in the entire NBA. The other is Detroit, and Detroit doesn't seem to be in nearly the same income bracket. Their interviews have been with coaches who will clearly be a bit less expensive than the proven tier the Rockets are looking at. I do believe it's clear the Rockets are looking for names that are a bit more proven, restore some credibility, put them in a better position entering the free agent market this summer, really make a splash hire to show the NBA marketplace, this fan base, all the entities involved that this organization is serious about winning. And I don't know where else Nick Nurse could turn. There's only two vacancies right now. I don't think Detroit is all that attractive. And I don't think they would meet his financial price anyway. And so would he give up that job if the Rockets aren't willing to guarantee it to him before leaving Toronto? I'm not so sure. And in the case of Toronto, it's not like there's a long-term contract. There's only 1 year left on it. They could easily, with a veteran core, just run it back for one more year, see what happens, and have a path to enter the coaching marketplace next summer. And so there's a report today out of Sportsnet based in Toronto that the Raptors' brain trust and Nurse have spent this week meeting daily, doing a deep dive into their season and trying to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. At the very least, that suggests there's a likelihood that this thing could stick together. If the differences were irreconcilable, we'd probably know it by now. That's what the report says, and that's basically common sense. And while it's possible that maybe Toronto panics, they've been linked to Ime Udoka in the past. If they think he's going to Houston, maybe they try and push for some sort of resolution with Nurse so that they can pursue Udoka themselves. If that's the case, I expect it to happen sooner rather than later. I think the Rockets would listen to him. He's qualified enough that certainly they would pick his brain and treat him as a serious candidate. But his resume is not so strong that you just bow down and say, this is our guy, and guarantee him the job without an interview. No, the interview process is very important to finding the alignment that Rafael Stone talked about at the press conference leading into this search as something that's especially important to them after these 3 years with Stephen Silas. And every day that passes, I think that it's less likely to find that with Nick Nurse. Now, as far as everything with Kenny Atkinson, it's not so much that I've heard anything negative about him. It's just that I know the concern going in was how bad does he want to be an NBA head coach? Keep in mind that he had verbally agreed to take the Charlotte job last summer, and then it just didn't happen. He had a change of heart. He wanted to stay in Golden State, where he has a pretty primo gig as the lead assistant to Steve Kerr, making good money in a great city. It's a perennial contender. And yet without any of the daily pressures of being a head coach, that level of responsibility. Does he truly want that type of grind, that lifestyle? I'm not sure. And while you can point to the fact that his lack of an interview is due to the Warriors being in a playoff series, Sam Cassell is in a playoff series, and we now know that interview is scheduled for Sunday. Every day that passes without a formal interview, again, the Rockets got permission to interview him. That part is not the problem. It's just about actually nailing down when he's going to come to Houston and go through this process. The longer it lasts without having anything concrete, the more I wonder if he's just content where he is. Aside from that, as I mentioned last time, I'm also a bit skeptical that the Rockets go with an offensive tilt to this hire. I think there's a decent chance they sort of go the opposite of the way they did with Steven and look for someone with more defensive chops, which is Udoka, Vogel, and maybe Nick Nurse if he comes available. Atkinson's more known for how innovative he is on the offensive side. I also think it's worth reiterating that while Atkinson does have former head coaching experience, it was with the Nets in a clear rebuilding phase. He helped get them off the ground in those post Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce years, but it's not like he's done it in a truly contending environment the way Udoka has with the Celtics, the way Vogel did with the Lakers, the way Nurse has done with the Raptors in 2019. What Kenny Atkinson did with the Nets was in a slightly lower pressure environment. And if you're the Rockets, in theory, you would like this coach to potentially be the guy leading you a few years from now when you're actually making a charge in the playoffs and trying to actually win at the highest level. So I do think that his overall resume is a little bit lighter to begin with, and he's probably not tilted in terms of his X's and O's expertise to the side of the ball that the Rockets are likely to prioritize in the search, which in my opinion is defense. Again, that's the common thread between Udoka and Vogel. But I do think if he shows a willingness to talk, they'll listen. He's qualified. I've been told he has a great relationship with Rothwell Stone going back to when Kenny Atkinson got his start in the coaching profession as a player development guy on the staff of Jeff Van Gundy in the mid 2000s with the Rockets. There's a relationship. They respect him, especially his offensive acumen. They'll listen. But every day that passes without anything concrete on that front reminds me beyond just the X's and O's, beyond the resume. One of the biggest questions with Atkinson going into this search was how bad does he want it relative to the quality lifestyle he has in San Francisco right now. And the fact that we're nearly 2 weeks into the search and we still don't have a confirmed date. This is not something I've been told from the Rockets. This is just my own opinion. But it does make me wonder if maybe he's just not as intense about this job as the guys that are clearly at the forefront of the list, that being Frank Vogel, former coach of the Pacers, Magic, and Lakers, and Ime Udoka, former coach of the Celtics, and of course, assistant for a number of teams, the Brooklyn Nets, and most notably the San Antonio Spurs, where I believe he was for 7 years and got a lot of pedigree working underneath Greg Popovich. So even though Udoka's just been a head coach for 1 year, again, he does have a lot longer tenure in the coaching ranks, did much of that alongside Greg Popovich, and he's also a former player, which I think has really helped him to build bonds. I think it's noteworthy that players like Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, even after the scandal and everything went down in Boston, still spoke so well of him throughout this year. Clearly, Udoka built a connection with those guys. And so I think working alongside Popovich, along with the playing background himself, that potentially helps him to do those things. And who knows? Again, we'll have to see how the whole puzzle fits together. It's not just who the head coach is. It's also pairing the head coach with a staff, including an associate. I wonder personally about the potential combination of Udoka and James Borrego. Both of them coached under Popovich in San Antonio. Borrego a bit more of an offensive tilt. Udoka, of course, defensive minded. To me, that could be an ideal combination. Perhaps Frank Vogel has someone in mind that has some offensive chops. We heard Caitlin Cooper on the last episode talk about how he typically loves having an NBA player on his staff because Vogel does not have that background personally. Who knows? Perhaps Adrian Griffin could be a fit there. Just throwing out ideas. But again, I think the Rockets will consider everything. They're leaving no stone unturned, pardon the pun. But I do think they're being very thorough in this search. And while it's going to move faster than 2020 in large part because the Rockets are much more desirable this time around, people know that this organization is going somewhere. They like what the future may hold for this group. At the same time, they're not going to rush it. They're going to do their homework. They're going to make connections. If nothing else, they're going to network. And then a week or two from now, they're going to make their actual final decision. Anyway, we talked a lot about Frank Vogel a few days ago with Caitlin Cooper. Now I want to do the same about Ime Udoka with Dr. Justin Quinn. Let's go ahead and get him connected. All right, now we've got Dr. Justin Quinn with us, managing editor of Celtics Wire, like Rockets Wire, property of USA Today Sports Media Group. Justin, thanks so much for taking the time. How are you?
Pretty good. Glad to be on.
Yeah, and Paolo, I'm guessing you're pretty excited for Ime Udoka talk, correct?
Yeah, I said leading to the last episode that Vogel's probably my number 4. I think Udoka, depending on what takes out about all of the concerns off the court and what happened in Boston, which I'm sure we'll talk about, I'd say he's probably my 3rd, maybe 2nd, depending on, I'm not sure about Kenny Atkinson, but you obviously know that I have Nurse number 1.
So let's start with the baggage, because that's the elephant in the room, and I don't want to punt it back any longer. Because let's be honest, if not for the baggage, he would not be available for the Rockets to consider. this time a year ago, he was one of the hottest young coaches in the NBA. He's just 45 years old. He's leading one of the most prestigious organizations in the game. He gets the Celtics to the NBA Finals. Everything is rolling. The stars of the team, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, to this day, they still love him. They still say great things about him. He had everything set up for him to be the Boston Celtics coach for a generation. And then all of a sudden, he's not. And I think a lot of people on the outside are sort of confused by this scandal. Of course, they superficially know what happened, but this is not a case of sexual assault. This was a case in which superficially people look at it and some of them say, well, because this was consensual, why did this rise to the level that he needed to lose his job? And clearly that stigma has stuck around with him since. We know the Nets looked at hiring him in November, ultimately chose to go with Jacques Vaughn instead. So just at a high level, Justin, if you could explain from the Boston perspective what it was about this situation. And of course, the Celtics brought in an independent outside law firm to investigate the alleged affair with a subordinate. Just explain why this rose to the level that the Celtics felt that he simply could not continue in his role as head coach.
Well, to be completely honest with you, I really, truly wish that I could, but really none of us can, because they have been ironclad with the flow of information regarding exactly what happened. What we do know is that there was a transgression, as you noted. We know that it wasn't something that rises to the level where someone's pressing criminal charges. There may still be civil suits that are being dealt with. There may not be. There may be other legal action going on. We have absolutely no idea where the situation is. It appears to be resolved between the team and Udoka, whether it is resolved with whoever or whatever parties were aggrieved in this situation. Presumably it's only one, but for a quick second, there were rumbles that there might be more than one person involved. I don't think that that's the case. I think that was a case of crossed wires or something like that. But with the very limited flow of information that we're getting or have gotten about this situation, it's really hard to go in any direction with making a judgment on things other than he made a very, very egregious error of judgment, as you noted, at the pinnacle of a position where he could have been set up for, literally a decade in his role.
Yeah, and I want to make clear off the top, and I'll make sure that both of you guys are in alignment, but it sounds like those comments, Justin, I think you will be. I'm going to limit the scope of our discussions about his baggage to what we know, as with, which is obviously very little. Because with any scandal, especially in the social media era, it's, like the tabloid industry on steroids. There's a lot of online currency that comes from people recklessly speculating and turning it into perhaps more than it was. Because what generally happens is once the general public sort of has their minds open to the idea that, oh, maybe this person is capable of something unsavory, that, and I guess this is beyond sports, let's just say like celebrity scandals. Once people accept this idea that someone is potentially capable of something unsavory, then there's a lot of online currency to be had from recklessly speculating and saying, oh, maybe this happened with multiple people. Maybe there's more to it than we know. Certainly go ahead.
There's a broader debate to be had in terms of who we're talking about with that online currency too, because without naming the people involved, who I honestly have to say, as an anthropologist, as my first vocation, we have a very different code of ethics than say journalism does. It's considerably more careful in terms of how we release information. And that's not a slight against journalism, because in most situations, the kind of NBA journalism that we see reporting on things that happen in the NBA don't need to be so sensitive. And as you suggested, and I think I'm glad you suggested the way that you did, because we know so little about these things, it needs to be said, on one hand, not to play devil's advocate here, but it is fair to say that many corporate organizations have an absolutely zero tolerance situation going on. There were rumbles and rumors that things had gone on for some time and that there had been warnings and such, but there's been no public confirmation of any of those things. And it could be something as simple as just an affair, or really not even an affair on Ime's side, because he was in, I don't know if it was an open relationship, but it was a relationship where
they weren't married.
They weren't married, exactly. So it wasn't exactly the same level of a situation as it was with the rumored person who was rumored, again, not confirmed, to be a married subordinate within the team. So it's very possible that that's all that this was, and that the situation then became, as we have heard, unwanted. And I don't want to speculate, but sometimes people make a phone call and say, well, why is that not unwanted? And in a situation like Udoka is in as head coach of the Celtics, that is construable as harassment. It's something that is very normal to do. And I don't want to make excuses for him, but that is something that could have happened. On the other hand of that same coin, it could have been much, much worse than that, and we simply don't know. So realistically, as you were saying, this whole rush to get things out, it gives a certain impression to the public that encourages that kind of speculation. And for the listeners of the Houston Rockets, I think what we've seen from Udoka since then has been the right call, staying out of the public eye, keeping his business to himself, avoiding any potential for further scandal. I think that even allowing himself to be involved in the Brooklyn Nets kerfuffle that happened not too long after that, in the middle of the regular season, that was probably not the best judgment on his part to be involved in that, if he was involved in that, just because I think it really was too soon.
Yeah.
Without knowing these things, there are people who have gotten second chances in the NBA who have done worse. And I am not the person who is going to tell you that without knowing what the situation is, but I do trust that the Houston Rockets organization is going to do above and beyond due diligence and probably surround him with some capable assistant coaches just in case.
Yeah. My main point with how we're framing this is just, in fairness to everyone involved, let's just stick with the reporting that's out there, because it's not just about in fairness to Ime. I know with what happened with the Celtics, there were all sorts of women that had nothing to do with this that had their pictures thrown all over social media with people recklessly speculating, could it have been so-and-so? And it's unfair to them. The bottom line is there's just so much online currency that comes from these scandals because there's people, bad faith actors, that realize they can basically monetize the curiosity. Oh, is there more to this? Could the story be even juicier? And so you'll hear people saying, oh, it's worse than or I heard from somebody else, and that somebody else is sort of a bad faith actor, that it's worse. No, and the reality is, and it's in fairness to Udoka as well, at least give him the opportunity to address the situation. In this case, like some of these, I've heard it's worse. Well, how can he even defend himself when there's not even an accusation? It's
he may not even be able to speak about it because of the legal situation that we alluded to. There may be gag orders. There may be, who knows what the agreement that was agreed to entails.
Yeah. The bottom line is it's something for the Rockets to investigate as far as their interviews with Udoka, as far as the people they speak with from the Celtics, the NBA, the vetting and background process. The Rockets should absolutely be asking these questions, and I'm confident they are. I've been told that they have looked into this. But as far as our discussion as total outsiders, I think the most fair thing to do is to concentrate solely on what we know, because for a lot of reasons, we've seen celebrity scandal after celebrity scandal where there's all these little tidbits about how it could be worse than it is, and many of them are just completely unfounded by people trying to milk the controversy for their own purposes, many times just online monetization. Paolo, is that fair with you?
Yeah, I think so. I think just like everything online, I mean, to a completely different context, we talked about earlier in the season that the narrative on, for example, Rafael Stone was made up by the media because, well, Rafael Stone didn't address it. And this is kind of the same thing. We have so little information that people just go out of their way to say whatever they want to say. And in the current social media age, there's no repercussion for anything that you might say, especially when Udoka and the Celtics are in a position where they can't really rebuttal anything. They've already made, it seems that they have already made the decision to keep everything indoors. That's the way it's going to be. But regarding the part that concerns the Rockets, right? You've got to make an investigation, right? And then you've got to define how much you're going to value the public opinion in relation to this, because no matter what you do, there's always going to be some people that complain. At the same time, you've got to set your level at how much are you willing to, or how far are you willing to go to show that you've done your research. I mean, depending on who you ask, people may mention that they expect some an outside like organization or an outside group of people to conduct a search and to conduct some sort of review on what happened. Some people might expect more. Some might expect the Rockets to, considering the trouble that they had on Twitter, or that Twitter had with them keeping Anthony Lamb for so long. There's still a lot of people that have questions about that as well. So some people will demand that the Rockets come out and just set their own code of conduct or some principles that they safeguard within their organization. At the same time, we're also talking about an organization in the Rockets that seems to care, or at least from the public eye, without any inside information, it seems to care about this sort of stuff. It's not directly related, but we also can't forget that the Rockets have done not a lot of work, but they have employed a lot of people in very high-profile positions that are minorities, and we can at least assert that the opposite, right? That those people weren't at a disadvantage for being a part of a minority. So we know the Rockets at least seem to be or have a very modern approach to it and be accepting of all of these things, like every NBA team should do, which makes me more confident that in a situation like this, that they would go through all of the extensive process that they need to go through to make sure that everything's all right with Ime Udoka's background. Because when you move on from that, which I think is what we're going to do extensively on this podcast, he's a tremendous head coaching candidate. Like this is like, he's really young. He's had 1 year, so a low sample size. And I know we'll get into the specifics, but really young, a really low sample size. But that sample size was crazy good.
Yeah,
all the intangibles, holding guys accountable, everything like that, not only off the court but on the court as well, which makes making this kind of research worth it. Hopefully they can come out of it with positive results, if that's what the truth aligns with.
It sounds like they have. Again, there's a couple of checkpoints in this. First off, do they interview him at all? Because I don't think this is something, due diligence isn't just checking a box at the end of the process and saying, oh, I made a call. No, this is the type of serious situation where you do your homework before you even bring him in. And I'm told they did, in terms of checking with his references in Boston and around the NBA and trying to learn more about this situation. And then step two is when he actually does his interview, which was yesterday, Wednesday, April 19th, then you talk to him about it. Well, what limited you can talk about it, as Justin mentioned, there might be a gag order. But the point that they're still talking about him as a serious candidate, both after, I guess, the initial vetting, and now bringing him into Houston and trying to talk to him individually, one-on-one, then that tells me that he has gotten past those initial checkpoints. So at least to this point, he is answering those questions, at least to the extent that he can, in a sufficient enough manner that the Rockets are willing to move forward. The other part of this that I want to underscore, and Justin already hinted at this, the timing is so different relative to the Brooklyn situation. I know a lot of people, and it persists to this day, started this narrative that because Brooklyn was reported to be interested in him, and then they suddenly went another direction with the Jacques Vaughn hire, that there must be more to the story, that the Nets found out. Not necessarily. I think the biggest thing that went wrong in Brooklyn is it was just far too soon. And there was also a separate scandal involving the Nets at the time. That was when Kyrie Irving was out with the anti-Semitic situation, with the comments that he had made. And so they were dealing with a lot of things organizationally at the time. And then just the timing, look, it was 7 games into the season. He had literally been facing 2 weeks of consequences, because I don't think anybody really cares about training camp or the preseason. In terms of actual consequences, the season was 2 weeks old. If he had walked almost immediately to another ready-made contender just 3 hours down the road, at the time, the Nets were a contender. They had both Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving on the roster. It would have felt to people like he did not face any consequences. And as Justin mentioned earlier, there's people that are open to giving second chances, but part of that process is believing that the person was held accountable for the original mistake, because that accountability then earns them the benefit of the doubt in the future. Because they're held accountable, people are more willing to say, hey, they learned their lesson. They're going to keep this in mind if this situation comes up in the future, and then it won't happen again. Now that there's been a season in between jobs, I think people are going to be much more open to giving Udoka a second chance. Because honestly, if you're not willing to give him a second chance now, when are you? If it's not 1 season, is it 2 seasons, 5 seasons? Is it never? Not saying you can't feel that way, but I do think that most people are going to be a lot more open to a Udoka reinstatement after a year off than they would have been after basically losing almost no games, almost no money, walking right into another East Coast contender. I think there's a lot of things about that would have rubbed people the wrong way that I don't think will apply to Houston. Basically, and Justin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the Celtics community that's tied into this would react nearly as negatively to Udoka being hired by the Rockets the next couple of weeks as they would have should he have been hired by the Nets last November, right?
Absolutely. And I think, your points about the timing and accountability are absolutely correct in this situation. I don't really think that in the future there will be teams necessarily as concerned about that for the reasons you outlined. But one thing that is sticking out to me is, does Udoka's timeline in terms of what he has shown us that he is good at coaching make sense for the Rockets? Because one of the things that I've been thinking about this whole time is whether the roster is necessarily a good fit for what he does. He does get players, ironically, to be more accountable. We had a nickname for him that turned out to be incredibly ironic in terms of it being Captain Accountability. And I don't know, like where the Houston Rockets are now, it seems like it could make sense in that if they do choose to hire him, the stakes will be much lower, right? They're not going to be attempting to compete for a title again immediately thereafter. So the main thing is just getting the roster under control, getting them to buy in and follow what he preaches, basically. So, I mean, I'd like to ask you if you think that in terms of timing of the Houston's development arc, if you think he's actually a good candidate, if there might be somebody better.
That's interesting. I do think that it's tough to fully answer that question because their roster is going to look so different a few months from now. We know between the $60 million in salary cap room and the incentive to win immediately because their picks are due to Oklahoma City starting next year from the ill-fated Russ CP trade from way back when, all of a sudden, these young guys like Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, Jabari Smith Jr. are going to be paired with veterans that might be more win-now pieces that make a bit more sense for the type of structure that Udoka typically puts into place. So I would just say it's tough to fully answer that question without knowing what the roster is going to look like heading into training camp. I do think it'll be at least a bit more Udoka-friendly than it is at this very moment. The other part is that the Rockets have to be opportunistic. I think when you make this hire, it's not that you can't make another coaching change in a few years, but I think in a perfect world, you would like for this to be the guy that is your coach a few years from now when this young group is actually trying to contend. And Udoka, the circumstances that led to him being available, combination of both youth and having proven success in Boston as an assistant for all those years with Greg Popovich, they're pretty unique. So even if the timing isn't perfect with where the Rockets are in their rebuild and the roster, it's also sort of a rare opportunity in that you don't know if you're going to find a guy of his stature available later. So even if the timing isn't absolutely perfect, even if the roster isn't ideal right now, and maybe some of these young players aren't necessarily ready for the Udoka style of accountability, the in-your-face nature, at least superficially, it feels very different than Stephen Silas. At the same time, there's also an opportunity too, because I'm not sure if that type of guy would be available to the Rockets at a later date. And so even if he's not maybe ideal year one, at the same time, if you think he is going to be ideal 2-3 years from now when these guys are fully developed, then you sort of have to balance those two factors. And I know Paolo's this is sort of his wheelhouse in terms of what the young guys need in their development. So I'll defer to him a little bit on that. But I would just say it's not just about the young players in place. It's a combination of what your roster is going to look like a few months from now. And then you also sort of have to factor in the next few years as well. And so even if it's not an ideal day one fit, maybe it evolves into that in a few years. And so you sort of weigh that as well.
A little pre-agency for coaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think all of the top 4 candidates that the Rockets have met, or that rumors have mentioned so far, are pretty perfect fits, because what we need basically, in my opinion, of course, is the opposite of what Stephen Salas was. Stephen Salas was very player friendly. He was more of a and this is kind of bad to say, but he was more of a, you're going to play for me because, or do this for me because if you don't, you're going to feel bad about it, rather than a, hey, this is a professional atmosphere. You've got to do this because this is what's expected of you. And if you don't, there's going to be consequences. And I think that's something that Udoka can bring to the table, that kind of accountability. When it comes to just being able to deal with a mesh of younger guys with older guys, I know Boston is kind of a different situation because, well, even their young guys are fairly experienced because they've been in a competent team basically their entire career. So to this point, especially Jason Tatum. But he did mesh Grant Williams, who was 23. He did mesh Jason Tatum, who was 23. Guys like Aaron Nesmith and Peyton Pritchard across basically the entire season, but Aaron Nesmith for parts of it. He did manage to somewhat mesh guys like that with the Al Horfords of the world, with the Josh Richardsons of the world, with the Dennis Schroeders of the world. If I'm not mistaken, he was with Boston as well. So I think he has that skill set, but I think above everything, the Rockets need accountability, and they need a coach that's going to make them focus on defense, especially because they have all of the offensive talent in the world. Ideally, I think they'd want a head coach that's going to balance that and demand, at the very least, effort on the defensive end, because I don't think they're going to be a good defensive team year one, maybe not even year two. But we've seen in spurts that when they try, they look a lot better. I mean, a perfect example of that is when they played the Celtics and beat them this year. When they try, they look a lot better defensively. And then because they are so athletic, their defense is very easily translatable into offense through transition. As the more turnovers you generate, the easier it is to play offense, because young team typically as currently constructed is not good at half-court offense. And so the least amount of half-court offense that you have to play, the better. And so to me, a lot of it just revolves around defense and getting guys to buy into a defensive scheme and actually building a defensive scheme that adjusts to either depending on what the Rockets want to do, either adjust the roster to the defensive scheme that Udoka wants to run, if it doesn't mean sacrificing any of the core pieces, of course, because that's the most important thing. But at the very least, have a defensive scheme that can adapt to those core pieces. Because what we were doing last year wasn't good for anyone. It was just a completely outdated Lionel Hollins style of defense that just didn't make sense at all. So it's not hard to be a major upgrade from Stephen Salas, especially if you're bringing in vets as well. But I think the two core principles that need to be introduced into this team are accountability and defense. So I think Udoka fits the bill, but I'm sure you'll be able to tell me about that a lot better than I do.
Well, I just wanted to mention, I don't think it's a very big thing because he seemed to be talking about the finals more so than the entire regular season. But Malcolm Brogdon, in an interview this season, told reporters that he had heard that Joe Mazzulla played a big role in the Celtics postseason defense.
I was actually going to ask you about the players. It's interesting that you mentioned that from Brogdon, who wasn't around last year. One of the things that really stood out to me this year, given the scandal, I expected a lot of the Boston players to steer away from Udoka topics. I was actually pretty surprised by how much Tatum and Brown in particular still seemed very willing to stand by Udoka and give him his props for how he built them a year ago. The fact that even though he's gone, they still credit him with being a big part of the rise of this team and how he helped them personally in their career development as well. Did that surprise you, the fact that it doesn't feel like the Celtics, at least the players, tried to avoid the Ime conversation? They seem to talk about it, not every single game, but, it wasn't like they just drew a line in the sand. They still seem to have a lot of appreciation, those guys that were around a year ago, for what he did.
Yeah, Marcus Smart could be included in that group vocally as well. Jason Tatum went as far as to say that his favorite coach he's ever been coached for, and this is someone who coached under Coach Mike Krzyzewski under Duke, that his favorite coach, he even coached with Pop in Team USA, previously, but he said that Udoka was his favorite coach while he was being coached by Mazzola. That might have been a little bit awkward. But, externally, I understand how that looks. But if you were there for media day, if you had heard what they had been saying in pressers, they were as confused as everybody else is about what happened. They know maybe a little bit more than we do, but for the most part, it seems they were blindsided by this as much as anyone else was. They seem to think it was fairly unjust based on what they know, and they haven't really been able to been told anything else since then. So whatever happened, they don't know any more about it than we do. And the only thing that they know is that this guy got them to the NBA Finals after years and years and years trying to break through that barrier. So there's something there in terms of the support he still continues to garner. But I don't know if we can really take it either way as indicative of what he did or did not do, because as far as we know, they know very little as well and have said it.
Oh, yeah. No, I wasn't saying it from the standpoint of what he did or didn't do. I just thought it was interesting that the connections that he built there were serious enough that they stood by him, even though there was, a pretty big firestorm, at least in the media, just an uprising of anti-Udoka sentiment once some of the rumors got out there. Again, it's tough to say exactly what's true and what's rumored, but we know the narratives that were out there, and they seem to stand by him. I found that noteworthy. Now, as far as year to year, it's been so interesting the last couple of years in Boston, because you can certainly argue that Udoka inherited a 500 team from Brad Stevens in 2021, and he got them to the next level. At the same time, they were never a 500 team in terms of talent. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, it's always been pretty deep, this generation Celtics, in terms of the depth of the roster, fairly young. They should have been better than they were the year before. There were also some injury factors in there as well. So it's tough to say that Udoka singularly took them to that next level. Now, the flip side, of course, you can say that they didn't fall off this year without him. They're still a number 2 team in the East. So it's not like all of a sudden he left and they went to nothing. Although, of course, a lot of his success and a lot of any team's success just comes down to the roster. And you add Malcolm Brogdon to what they had a year ago, and it's obviously one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference simply based on talent. It's a very, very good team. So how do you sort of blend together the last 3 years? You've had 3 different coaches. How much of their rise is attributable to Udoka? How much is circumstances? And how much, if any, should people be alarmed by the fact that, there hasn't been much of a fall off this year from the team that won the Eastern Conference a year ago?
Well, you've probably seen some hand-wringing from Celtics fans, mostly. A couple analysts, but mostly Celtics fans, when they lose some pretty, shall we say, no offense to the Houston Rockets or the Oklahoma City Thunder, about games they definitely should have won.
Right.
And the reasons why they lost those games and the reasons why the fans were so frustrated, and some analysts, were because they were exactly the same reasons they were a 500 team for such a long time, in that even when they were the clearly more talented team, the consistency of being able to approach each game throughout the course of a long regular season with the kind of focus and energy and connectedness and communication that is necessary to build a winning record, it just wasn't there. So people freaked out about that. And what that tells me is that this is still a relatively young team for a contending team. I mean, it's not incredibly young like some of the teams out there that we're seeing in the playoffs this season, but the Celtics, most of their stars have not even turned 28 yet. Most of the key players on the team, I think Marcus Smart be one of the few examples of the younger core who is actually over 28. And even his habits really weren't all that great until this season. This is one of the first seasons where he actually shoots from places where he's good at, doesn't shoot the team out of games, doesn't try to take over when that malaise I was hinting at sets in. And I think, and this is just a theory because, again, we can't really ever peel the onion away to see exactly what layers did what to who and how. But my instinct is that Brad Stevens, when he was the coach, he had the vision, but he couldn't reach the players. He wasn't a player, so he didn't get the same kind of ear as we all know that people who'd formerly played in the league tend to get from other players. So he smartly brought in the person who had all the things that he was not. He doesn't like the kind of very vocal accountability, at least in terms of how he comports himself with the press and his players in public. So getting Udoka to get that kind of commitment out of them, I think, was the thing they needed in that moment. I don't know that they needed it moving forward, and you really hope that any team that gets a coach like him, that gets that kind of result out of a team, won't continue to need to have him do that forever, right? Mm. So for me, I think they mostly learned what they needed to learn. And then we saw, like they came out like a house on fire, the Celtics, to start the season. But again, a season is really, really long. And the, shall we say, deficiencies recurring, I think, were more a product of boredom than, say, Joe Mazzola not being the same kind of coach or using the wrong kind of motivation. So if your team needs this kind of motivation, I think Udoka is a very, very good option, all other things bracketed. It's just a question of, is that what the team needs? And you guys would know better than I would for that.
That's fair. I want to transition into more of an X's and O's discussion. We'll start with defense because that's where his pedigree is. And I was talking to someone with the Rockets today about the differences between Udoka and Vogel. And I talked about this with Caitlin Cooper the other day on our Vogel pod. And so when I was talking to my person with the Rockets, they talked very generally about how they're both very good defensively, but resumes are very different, and they're also different people as well in terms of how they connect. And I think the former player connection is a big part of what works with Ime, as opposed to Frank. What Caitlin was saying is that he typically prefers having a former NBA player in a prominent position on his staff. Think Jason Kidd with the Lakers, because I think it helps him sort of mitigate that deficiency. So how they go about it is very different, even if they both are known for their defensive chops. And I think when we're looking at Udoka specifically, one thing that Caitlin mentioned, she thinks he's a lot more flexible with his scheming than Vogel is at times. And she cited the turning point defensively for the Celtics a year ago was when they started using Robert Williams as basically a roaming big, a free safety. Is that a fair characterization to you?
Yes and no. It worked really well and fairly quickly compared to how they were trying to use him before that. And honestly, he was just so lost out there in a switch everything defense that it was really the only option that they could use in that situation to get him to work. I maybe, I'm not an NBA coach, so don't take my word as gospel, but I mean, he stumbled on it very quickly. It worked and he continued with it. That at least tells you that he has a willingness to explore when things aren't working, which is something that you don't see in every coach.
Yeah. Her contention was that Vogel is more of a high floor guy. He consistently gets his guys to try very hard. That's something over his 10 years with the Pacers was very consistent, and she wanted him to be a bit more flexible in his schemes. For example, the Pacers had a very definitive way they chose to defend, especially in the Roy Hibbert years, and they weren't as tactically creative as she wanted, as opposed to the Celtics. Now, maybe there was some desperation mixed into it, but they sort of found that Robert Williams model and ran with it. And so she looked at Udoka as having a bit more, I suppose, upside. I'm paraphrasing here, being a bit more creative, whereas Vogel is someone that's a bit higher of a floor, in part because you've also seen Frank Vogel inherit such a wide variety of circumstances. The 6 years he was a head coach in Indiana, obviously it went everything from rebuild to contender in the Paul George years before his leg injury. Then they sort of slid back to rebuilding again. 2 years in Orlando, where quite frankly, the roster was terrible. Nobody had a shot. Then the complete opposite in LA, where you're dealing with LeBron James, Anthony Davis, contending expectations, and guys with big egos to manage. And so Vogel's been in a lot of different situations, and he's at least found a consistency of effort in all of them. And that's commendable. And clearly he knows what he's doing defensively. With Udoka, he hasn't had nearly that level of diversity to his resume to this point. As at least a head coach he's had, and that's something important to the Rockets. They do want someone that's proven after hiring a first-time head coach and Steven Silas last time. That's a vibe I've pretty strongly gotten. Udoka, for all of his success, it was within a certain box with the Celtics that, as you mentioned earlier, Justin, is not going to be really analogous to the situation in Houston, especially not day one. So the way I see it, like contrasting the two guys, Vogel is perhaps a bit safer in that you've seen him in a much longer sample, even though their ages actually aren't that different. I think Udoka is 45, Vogel is 49. Vogel's got a much longer track record, but at the same time with Ime, you're betting a bit more on the intangibles. This idea that, he's potentially very creative. You talked earlier about the connections that he forms with the players, his ability to bond with them and relate to them in ways that even Brad Stevens couldn't. So it feels almost to me, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but just superficially looking at the two frontrunners, or believed to be frontrunners, in Frank Vogel and Ime Udoka. Frank Vogel is a bit safer. He's a bit more conventional. And the case for Ime Udoka feels a bit more about the little things, the intangibles, and betting on how that's going to translate. Does that make sense to you? Just from your perspective in Boston, how do you compare those guys?
That is actually a very good way to put it. You mentioned a box for Ime Udoka, and I actually think that the concept of a metaphorical box works better for Vogel in that he has a way that he thinks defense and NBA teams in general should play, and he coaches the team into it, that being the box, metaphorical. In the case of Udoka, one of the things you will hear from former Celtics players is that he let them be the player they are and developed a system for them to work together. So rather than a preconceived notion of how they should play, he starts with the tools that he has. And say Frank Vogel wants to make an omelet, but he figures out he doesn't have quite the right ingredients, so he has to go to the store and get the new ingredients, to use a terrible metaphor. Udoka will make a frittata instead, because that's what he's got. And the frittata is going to be amazing because he really got the most out of those ingredients.
For the record, what I meant by box was the roster configuration. He walked into not a perfect situation, but we just saw how he inherited this one particular set of circumstances. Whereas Vogel with the Pacers, the Magic, and the Lakers, they've been all over the spectrum in terms of going into a given year or going into a given job. What did he inherit? And so I meant with Udoka, he's only had that one box in terms of the configuration of what he's taken over.
Absolutely. Yeah, he doesn't have a long track record, but he does have assistantships with the Nets, with San Antonio, and with the 76ers that I'm sure they're looking pretty hard at as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think he made a really interesting point about how Udoka will fit a system to the players rather than the opposite, especially in a team in which, right now the players aren't really, it's not set in stone what they're going to be. They're constantly changing, right? Who knows what Jalen Green's game will be? We know we have an outline of it, but we don't quite know what it will look like in a few years. Same thing with, most of the guys on this team, with the exception for whatever vets they bring in. And it's interesting because I kind of like that. I called for Steven Silas to do that a lot, and I really like that because that kind of leaves the player development part of it to the people responsible with the player development. And then those people decide what the vision is for a certain player, what they should work on. And then Udoka does the actual head coaching job, which is managing the chess pieces and, finding the best system for them to work within. I think that's really encouraging. That being said, I actually have a question that ties into a little bit of what you said about his assistant years. He was with the Spurs for a long time. And then he spent a year in Brooklyn, a year in Philly, and then he was a head coach with the Celtics. And my question is, to put it more clearly, how since then, two of his assistants, Musala, who is now the head coach of the Celtics and has been pretty successful. We don't know how far he will take them in the playoffs, but the regular season he's been fairly successful. And Will Hardy, who's now the head coach of the Jazz and that had that Jazz team overperform everyone's expectations. They were expected to be where the Rockets are, and they were fighting for the play-in until the last week. How much do you think the Celtics' success last year in the 1 year sample size we have of Udoka, how much do you think is credited to Udoka himself? And how much do you think that would be, or some of it would be lost without two assistants that at the time were assistants, but now look like really good NBA head coaches?
Well, he definitely assembled a really good team. Damon Stoudemire ended up getting a job at Georgia Tech out of the bargain as well. And I would be very, very surprised if his name doesn't end up in NBA head coaching circles within a few years as well. So he definitely put together an amazing team, very heavily Portland oriented. He's a Portland native, as I'm sure y'all will get quite familiar with if you end up hiring him for the Rockets. But it's really hard to say. Everything that you hear from Pop, everything that you've heard from people who he has coached, like Al Horford played for the 76ers when he was there. There were other Celtics players who played under him at previous stops as well, and they all absolutely rant and rave about how he was as a head coach, how he connected with them, how he motivated them, even when he wasn't the head coach. So I do think that a lot of it is his. But as I alluded to earlier with a Malcolm Brogdon quote about, at least in the postseason, Mazzulla being more involved in orchestrating the team's defense in that particular part of the season, or postseason, I should say, I do think that at least enough of what we saw with the Celtics was coming from the mind of Udoka that we shouldn't hand too much credit to his assistants. But again, it's really, really hard to peel this stuff apart. You just have to go to what people say and kind of try to triangulate.
Do you have a sense for what his general needs would be for the staff beneath him? For example, I know just in general terms, again, he's talked about as a bit more of a defensive coach. So that's why a lot of Rockets fans have sort of coalesced around this idea of James Borrego, former Hornets coach, who obviously has some offensive chops, did some great things with LaMelo Ball over his years in Charlotte, potentially being the offensive guy to help him out on that side of the ball. Not that's necessarily a weakness, but just when you look at where is his pedigree, where is his experience, where is his known level of expertise, and then filling out the staff accordingly. And obviously that's something he did a great job of in Boston, given what's happened with the guys you just mentioned and the years since and the success they've had getting jobs elsewhere. Just at a high level, where are his deficiencies, and what do you think sort of the types of roles that he would look for as far as best optimizing a staff of assistants beneath him?
Well, I do think Borrego, or someone with NBA experience as a head coach, or at least a high-level assistant, would be good, not only for his weaknesses, if they are weaknesses on offense, but also for what we alluded to before, someone who could be there waiting in the wings if, God forbid, something did end up happening in the future with him that was untoward. I don't think anything's going to, but then also we didn't think anything was going to happen. I mean, why would you do something like that in this situation, right? So who knows? In terms of actual coaching staff, besides that, he had a pretty big coaching staff. He relied on a lot of people to work around the margins. So I wouldn't be surprised if he assembled a fairly large staff, but that seems to be the direction that most teams are heading in anyway at this point. I'm really also curious to see, and this is kind of a tangent, but there's a lot of things coming in with the new CBA in terms of trying to build a contender. And at least for now, I don't think it's going to be a very big deal if he has an offensive coordinator type coach working with him because of where the Rockets are at. But if what you were saying ends up panning out, and they do have the resources to do it, and there's all those rumors of James Harden wanting to come back to Houston. If a team like that gets put together, I'm wondering like how long coaching lifespans are going to be, because contention life cycles might be considerably shorter as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair point. And by the way, on the Harden front, I should mention, I suspect Boston's going to have a lot of support from Houston the next couple of weeks, because those Rockets fans that want James Harden back, and while not everyone, I do think most people will come around on that. I think it's nearly universally understood that if Boston beats Philly in the second round, that cannot hurt the chances of James Harden leaving Philadelphia. So as a side note, I think the Celtics are going to find some support down here simply because that makes it all the more likely that Harden considers his options in free agency. So keep that in the back of your mind. Celtics may have some newfound support.
You guys might end up with your own version of our BLA chant, which has nothing to do with the Lakers directly. It was from the season in the 80s when the 76ers were whooping the Celtics posteriors and ended up being the team that beat LA.
We're going to transition from defense to offense, but I'm going to get one more, I guess, defensive-oriented thing in before we close things out looking at the offensive side. The big debate for the Rockets, everybody knows Jalen Green's a part of the future. Everybody knows Jabari Smith Jr. is part of the future. It depends on just what position, what role you want to optimize him at. Alperen Şengün is the one that's a bit more uncertain. The skills are there. There's also some clear deficiencies on the defensive end. I'm curious your thoughts on how Udoka's system, and it sounds like he tends to optimize to the players that he has when possible. But Şengün's a bit of a wild card in that it's a bit tougher to build the traditional defense with a rim protector. That model is tougher to work with Şengün in your starting lineup. And so there's been a lot of talk of, long-term, does Jabari Smith turn into your 5? He's lightweight, but he can eventually put on more weight, and he's got good instincts at defending near the rim. He's certainly got the height and length already. Do you bring in a more proven rim protector in free agency? Maybe you end up drafting one with your high 2023 draft pick. If you get hashtag pray for Victor, if somehow that works out, then that may resolve itself. But I guess, Şengün, everyone knows his offensive potential. Now, you may need to run more through him to fully optimize that, do a bit more dribble handoffs the way you see the Sacramento Kings do with Domantas Sabonis. But there's just always the question of, do you get enough defensively, or do you get enough offensively to offset what you potentially lose defensively? So what do you think of the Şengün model? Does that potentially work with the way Udoka's defenses typically function?
Absolutely. And I would say that the Minnesota Timberwolves are in the mess that they're in now because of the success that Udoka had with both Al Horford and Robert Williams on the floor. Now, you need to be able to have someone who can shoot, obviously, if you're going to have Şengün. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he has not developed a jumper.
So it's weird. For the most part, no. He actually shot like 33% on threes this year, but it was on super low volume. So that's the thing. Like, they would like him to develop a jumper, and he's actually showed some promising signs, but you can tell that it's very much a, work in progress. Like, he doesn't really trust it.
Now, I haven't kept up with Usman Garuba, for example, but there were some thoughts that he would be able to develop a three-point shot at the next level. I don't know if it's coming along or not. But
that has a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
He's a sharpshooter. What do you mean? He shot 40% from 3.
Well, again, low volume.
Yeah. So if you can get someone who can shoot the rock next to him, and he can shoot it a little, you might even be a little bit better off than the Celtics were early on in the double big era. They brought it back a little bit this season, but Robert Williams being out injured for much of the season had Derek White supplant him in the lineup, kind of making everything a little bit smaller. They still have it in their back pocket as something to work with, but considering that it is both primarily a defensive strategy that can work on offense and good for a team that really needs to find out how to play together on defense the way they need to if they want to contend, I think it might actually be exactly what your bigs need in Houston.
Interesting.
A lot of people have drawn kind of comparisons from profile-wise defensively between what you could do. And this happened especially back during the draft process last year with Chet Holmgren. A lot of people compared, if Chet could play the Robert Williams role, maybe Şengün could play more of the Al Horford role. It's tough because Al Horford's such a great defender, has such great instincts, although he doesn't have the best athletic tools. He's so smart that he puts himself in positions to still be able to play very good defense. But on the flip side, Ben talked about, the offense has to be worth the defense for Şengün. The Rockets are kind of a unique team in the sense that, they'll likely bring in a traditional point guard, which is a big key point that I want to ask you about. Do you think Udoka really needs a traditional point guard to get the team into sets? Or do you think the model that I think Marcus Smart was kind of that impromptu for them? But do you think that he can just make it work without one and more of a combo guard setup? Because the Rockets can go in a lot of different directions, whether it is Scoot Henderson or James Harden in that regard. And then they're also very unique in the sense of, Jalen Green, shot profile-wise, can be a lot like Jaylen Brown, but with a lot more rim pressure, I would say. But just in the sense of the mix between off-ball and on-ball. But then you have this complete, wild card, which is Şengün, which I don't think really on offense equates to anybody that the Celtics have. How do you think Udoka would be able to adapt to, or his offense to, this weird mix that Houston's got going on?
Well, as Ben said, I don't know if the team is going to look exactly like it does now. I will say that for years and years and years and years, I mean, Marcus Smart is currently the longest tenured Celtic, and he has seen point guard after point guard after point guard be signed to the team, traded to the team, and have to deal with Kemba Walker, Kyrie Irving, etc. When he was at Oklahoma, a point guard. So he was pushed into this role of shooting guard, and he was, to be fairly generous about it, not the best shooting guard. Somehow he manages to make people respect his three-point shot, which I think is like career 33.6% or something like that. But Udoka recognized that he had a good point guard, even when Kemba Walker was still on the roster and not playing particularly well. Actually, it was at the same season. Anyway, and he put Smart into the role of a traditional point guard when he had been playing more of a combo guard kind of a role, and really got the most out of him in a way that I think transformed how Smart is currently playing. So I don't know if it was the accountability. I don't know if it was being recognized as an actual point guard that got him to really stop shooting the Celtics out of the game, doing Marcus Smart things to a level where they stop helping and start hurting. I'm sure you've all seen it before. It's something that I think that with the roster that you have now, maybe he could identify whether or not, say, like Kevin Porter Jr. really is actually a point guard, or if he's kind of more of a wing. I think the one thing that he is good at, and we've kind of touched on this before, is finding out the player he has, what they're good at, what their skills really lie in, rather than what they've been trying to be pushed in, as we saw with Marcus Smart, and then bringing that out of them in a way that makes sense for everyone else on the team.
So he can make more of a combo guard type like Smart into a point guard if need be. But ideally, if given the chance, would you say that he'd rather have a true point guard so he doesn't have to adapt someone into that role?
We've only had one season for him to work with,
True.
and that is what he did. So I really couldn't give you an alternative view. I haven't followed his career as an assistant, and really on the defensive side of things, I don't think he would have too big of a role on that. But I do know that the one good thing about Udoka is identifying that talent that is there and then finding the puzzle pieces, putting it together into something that makes sense.
Interesting.
So I think we're pretty much winding down. Is there anything else that you can think of, Justin, that we haven't covered, that as far as the Rockets specifically, that would be either good or bad pertaining to Udoka's candidacy?
I would take a good hard look at the other candidates, not necessarily because I don't think Udoka should get another chance, or I don't think he's probably, in terms of the other stuff bracketed, the best candidate that is in the mix. But I do think that you might be surprised in the same way that Celtics fans are surprised by people like Joe Mazzulla and Will Hardy showing out in their current roles. You might miss on somebody by passing on, say, a Sam Cassell. So okay. I do hope they take a nice hard look at all of the candidates, because, you know, being a head coach in the NBA is a privilege and not a right. And for as much as we want to laud Udoka's ability on the court, he had to know on some level what he was doing was potentially detrimental, if not massively detrimental, to his goals and his team's goals. And that's not something that should be discounted. I know the Houston Rockets are going to do the due diligence and take all of that into an account, but as a fan, that would concern me.
Fair enough. So obviously the front runners at the moment appear to be Vogel and Udoka. As far as the other guys that they've interviewed, James Borrego of the Hornets, you mentioned Sam Cassell, who's interviewing Sunday. Kenny Atkinson, they've been given permission to interview. We'll see what happens with Nick Nurse and the Raptors. Are there any of those that particularly stand out as intriguing to you, or is it just sort of like cast a wide net and see who clicks?
Well, I'm pretty sure Nick Nurse is going to be coaching someplace else in the near future, but I'm not too sure that he's a particularly good fit. I think Frank Vogel would be an interesting fit as well, because, as we have also kind of alluded to, he has been able to thrive in some fairly, shall we say, complex situations, and he'd be stepping into one. If the team is moving in the direction you hinted at, I think he might even be a slightly better, safer bet if they really want to push their chips in and compete right away, because that payroll issue, I'm assuming that if you build this team, you grow into it, you could hit that 2-season super tax, second apron, whatever you want to call it, and trigger some pretty intense stuff that we don't need to talk about now. But it's got some. It's going to be very interesting to see how teams take all of these things together because none of them are really separate anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, there's so many factors that we, quite frankly, because we haven't seen the term sheet yet, we can't even fully go into as outsiders. That teams, of course, they have a better understanding of what the new CBA is going to mean in coming years. And yeah, it's a complicated puzzle for sure. And we're only dealing with what we know on the outside. So yeah, it's interesting. The Rockets have a very limited window now where they can aggressively spend. And then a few years from now, assuming these guys pan out, it's going to get very interesting in a hurry because, of course, you're going to have Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, Jabari Smith Jr., those types of guys due for their second contracts. And all of a sudden, now the salary cap is going to rise proportionally, but still, assuming these guys work out as the Rockets think and hope many of them will, then yeah, it's going to be an expensive roster a few years down the road. And combine that with the fact that you owe all this draft capital to Oklahoma City, which is one of your rebuilding rivals. You don't want to give them good draft picks if you can avoid it. And so, yeah, there's definitely an incentive to try and, maximize every reasonable win. I mean, I don't think they're going to just throw caution to the wind and say, screw it, development doesn't matter. No, you're still going to have at least 3 high lottery picks from the last 3 drafts. And Şengün is pretty much at that status as well. I think, it's going to be a blend. But yeah, there's a lot of competing interests that they're going to have to factor in. But one of them is definitely incentive to win and win quickly. And so perhaps Frank Vogel can fit in that regard. I think Udoka can as well. But you're right. There's definitely some baggage that the Rockets will have to consider as they go through this process. Paulo, is there anything else that you wanted to add before we close out?
Yeah, I want to ask one more thing before we close out. Are there any, assistants that you'd think Udoka could bring in? Any names in specific that maybe left the Celtics in the in-between time? Because we've talked about the connection he has with Borrego from the Spurs days. Is there any more names like that we should keep an eye out for?
Off the top of my head, from the Celtics organization, Jerome Allen maybe with the Detroit Pistons.
Okay.
Interesting.
Beyond that, I think we've been picked pretty clean.
That's what I was going to say. It feels like you've already been picked over. Yeah.
Yeah, they really need to get some new talent in the Celtics organization. So we might be competing for some of the same people this time next year.
Yeah, that was all I had because I think particularly the Udoka Borrego combo is really exciting, especially, and I recommend everybody listening to go check out the Kelly Eco piece that he dropped on Jim Borrego and his philosophies offensively. It features one of his assistants at the time in Charlotte. It's exciting to think about the combo of how they would complement each other, especially with this team, and especially how Borrego might have something in his bag about how to use Şengün, because I mean, obviously not to the same extent, but Mason Plumlee is also, who he had back with Charlotte, is also someone who can be used in a lot of the same dribble handoff situations.
Yeah, and I think to Justin's point earlier, it's absolutely a valid consideration to have someone on your staff, if you hire Ime Udoka, with previous NBA head coaching experience, just in case the worst case scenario happens. You're certainly not planning on it, but the Celtics were not planning on being thrust into the situation that they were put into last September either. So you do have to be aware of, even if it's a 1 or 2% scenario, that possibility. And so I think that's something that sort of lends credence to the Udoka Borrego model as well, and that it provides you with a small bit of an insurance policy just in case the bottom falls out and there's more to this situation than we currently know. Because while we explained off the top the reasons why we're sort of giving him the benefit of the doubt and not going that road or down that road, at the same time, you can't rule out the possibility. So I think if they go in the Udoka direction, that's a name that I hope they really look into. And honestly, it would make sense for Borrego as well, because this is a very talented team as far as the prospects and specifically what they can do offensively. So if he wants to position himself for the next head coaching job that comes available to them, potentially putting up numbers with a young Houston team with a ton of playmakers and scorers offensively, that might be the way to do that. Anyway, with that, I'll bring today's episode to a close. For Paolo Alves and Dr. Justin Quinn, I'm Ben Dubose. If you want more from us in the near future, the best place to get it is on Twitter. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. Paolo is on there at Paolo Alves NBA. Justin is on there at Justin Quinn with 3 N's, correct?
That is correct. Long story, popular name.
There we go. That'll explain it. Well, Justin, thanks so much for taking the time and filling us in on Ime Udoka.
Happy to. Thanks for having me.
Yep. And that'll do it for today. One last plug, the Logger Line on Twitter. That's where you can find the link tree to our show, which will have all the links to Rockets Wire, to Sports Talk 790, to Carbach Brewing, all of our partners and sponsors. You can simply go to the Logger Line on Twitter and find those links, and that's how you can consume their content as well. With that, we'll put a bow on this episode. Again, for Paolo and Justin, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode here at the Logger Line.